How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today on Climate One, we sit down with noted Penn State professor Michael Mann and head of the California Academy of Sciences Jonathan Foley. When Mann and colleagues published the infamous hockey stick papers in 1999, he soon found himself under attack by climate skeptics and conservative politicians. We begin with the story of one Texas congressman who aggressively came after him. Climate One starts now. Around 2005, Joe Barton, a Republican congressman from Texas, there were some hearings. Tell us about that. Take us to that place and tell us that story.
Yeah, well, of course, Joe Barton is now known for other things. Joining a long list of climate change politicians who've recently found themselves out of office or stepping down from office. Barton, back in 2005, as the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, sent essentially a subpoena to me, demanding all of my personal emails and all of my, every scrap of paper, back of a napkin calculation that I ever did throughout my entire career, based on the straw man notion that it was our hockey stick papers that formed the sole basis for concern about human influence on climate, which of course is absolutely silly. If there never was a hockey stick, if there never was the dozens of other studies that have come to the same conclusion as our hockey stick paper, we would still have overwhelming evidence, multiple lines of evidence that tell us that climate change is real and human caused and already a problem. But because it was an iconic graph, it was easy to cynically sort of create this straw man that the entire weight of evidence and the entire reason for concern was the hockey stick graph. And if we could just find an email that would embarrass Mike Mann, that would, prove that in fact he had, invented this out of thin air, then the entire weight of evidence for climate change would come crashing down like a house of cards. Of course, it's ridiculous and it's cynical to believe that, but that was it was sort of part of this effort. If you could take an icon, be it polar bears in the Arctic, discrediting the science there, Al Gore, making it seem like it's all just about Al Gore and his electricity bills, or the hockey stick. If you can convince people that the entire weight of evidence depends on this one strand, then it's a way to cynically try to sow doubt and confusion.
Republicans came to your defense.
Well, that's right. So Joe Barton was a powerful committee chair, Energy and Commerce Committee, but there was another powerful committee chair, Sherwood Boehlert, who was an old school pro-science, pro-environment Republican, who, when Barton issued this subpoena, he spoke out probably in the most, stopped just short of calling out his fellow Republican, Joe Barton, for engaging in modern-day McCarthyism in these attacks against us. It was
How
really
quaint that seems, yes.
Well, it was almost unprecedented to see, two powerful and influential Republicans going to battle like that. And if it were not for the fact that Sherwood Boehlert came out in our defense, and John McCain, who co-authored an op-ed denouncing Joe Barton's witch hunt against me and my colleagues, if it were not for the fact that there were influential Republicans who came out at a time when Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency, if that hadn't happened, then who knows, what we would have been in store for. So it's important to realize that there are politicians of good faith on both sides of the aisle. I think it's something that we can hope we see more of in the years ahead because, of course, we've seen a disappearance of that good faith in recent years.
Michael Mann, we've seen the Center for Disease Control, say have certain lists that they can't set science-based, et cetera. What impact is this sort of, changing the language? It was one thing to sanitize government websites. It's another thing to have kind of not quite burned books, but banned phrases and words. What effect is that having in the scientific community?
It's not the explicit censorship that is the biggest problem here. It's the self-censorship that comes with that. When scientists think that if they mention terms like climate change or sea level rise in the abstracts of their proposals, that the proposal, a program manager who might want to do the right thing, but who fears retribution from above, may choose not to fund that proposal. They're going to have to defend it. They're going to have to defend it to their superiors, ultimately to political appointees and operatives. And so you get this sort of self-censorship where scientists themselves stop using the appropriate language to describe the research that they want to do. And pretty soon they're shying away from that research. They're moving away from the research that they perceive as controversial. And what you lose is the sort of hard-hitting scientific research that's necessary if we are going to inform assessments of risk. I mean, here we are talking about what is potentially the greatest threat that we face as a civilization. And that's not just me, that's not just scientists, that's our national security community telling us that this is an existential threat. And if we decide that we can no longer do research that informs the decision-making process and how we deal with that threat and how we become more resilient in the face of these challenges, everybody loses out, society loses out. We can't afford to allow that to happen. There's too much at stake.
We don't know a lot about the budget. This is always a moving target these days. Congress never seems to agree on a budget. They just kind of kick it down for a few weeks or months. But Michael Mann, do we know if the funding to the National Science Foundation, to the major scientific institution in this country, is the funding drying up? Is the resources drying up for the kinds of research that we need to have to understand where this climate is going?
Yeah, well, right now we don't have a budget. We're on continuing resolutions, so funding managers are afraid to commit new funds to fund science. And so, first of all, just in this atmosphere of uncertainty where we don't have a science budget, it's very difficult for funding managers to make the longer-term decisions that they need to make about funding of basic research. And, of course, there has been a threat on the part of the administration and congressional Republicans to substantially decrease funding specifically for climate change. In many cases, there has actually been an effort to defund sub-areas of science that deal specifically with climate change at the National Science Foundation, at NASA, at NOAA, at the funding agencies, without realizing that, once again, it is, their stakeholders. It is the insurance industry. It is farmers, the agricultural industry. It is all of us who stand to lose out if we don't have reliable information to make decisions.
John Foley, there's lots of talk about how cities and states can fill the gap, the policy void created by the federal retreat or federal going in a different direction. But this is one area where cities and states don't have the billions of dollars that the federal government does. They can't step in and fill that funding gap the way they can in other places. Is that fair?
I think it's fair from definitely from the science point of view. Like there's no replacing the federal government in terms of investing in long-term R&D, the satellites that we fly across the planet to monitor our environment, our climate, our weather. This matters when a hurricane's barreling towards your state, by the way. I remember a story by Jane Lubchenco, who used to be the head of NOAA, when she was explaining to a congressional member of Congress, I won't say what party, you can guess, but why we needed to fund weather satellites. He looked at her and says, well, we don't need to pay for weather satellites, I just need to turn on the Weather Channel.
Right.
A member of Congress actually said that, and not realizing, of course, I hope you all know, that the Weather Channel gets that data from NOAA satellites. So this is undermining the investment in everything. But where I think cities and states can help lead, though, is perhaps on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on buildings, building codes, transportation, a lot of those decisions on climate solutions. actually are governed sometimes even more at the local, state, and county levels, or by corporations, or by multinationals. So I think that there's a very complex environment here, but science is getting hammered. And if we don't know what the problem is, it's very hard to engineer a good solution to it.
Michael Mann, speaking of weather, you were boarding a plane one time, and the pilot asked to speak to you. Tell us that.
That's right. I thought I was in trouble.
Not because you were drunk and disorderly. No,
Meteorologist on the plane.
No, it was the flight attendant came back and asked me, "Are you Michael Mann?" And I didn't know if I should answer yes or no. And the pilot had recognized me and wanted to talk with me. And in fact, he was convinced that he is seeing the impact of climate change on aviation, on turbulence in the atmosphere. And he was quite informed. It turns out that he follows, the climate literature and the blogs, and he sort of knew what he was talking about. And he was absolutely convinced that he is seeing changes in sort of turbulence that are unusual in his career, and that he thinks are a manifestation of climate change, and it's consistent with what we expect. We do expect more turbulent energy in the atmosphere as it warms up, to me that really drove home not just the fact that I have to be careful what I do and say, because people do actually recognize me now and then, but it really conveyed to me in a very profound way the fact that the impacts of climate change are no longer subtle. People are feeling them and seeing them in their daily lives, and I think that's making a huge difference when we try to communicate to the science and its implications to the public. They sort of get it now at a level that I don't think they did in the past.
It's hitting as I said, everything, everywhere that we do and touch pretty much every day. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the extreme cold in the eastern United States, warm in the West, warm in the other parts of the world. So explain to us how that is related to climate change. Because you always hear this, oh, it's cold, so climate change isn't happening.
Right, and it's really it's a nuanced issue, and of course, when you talk about it, when you talk about the possibility that cold extremes could be impacted by climate change, the critics will naturally say, "Oh, look, there they are. It doesn't matter if it's cold or it's warm. They're blaming everything on climate change." And in fact, I sort of walked into that a bit when I wrote a blog about the extreme winter weather and the role that climate change might be having. And Al Gore tweeted a link to my piece, and of course, and then the feeding frenzy ensued. And it is, it does require you to get into some nuances, and it's so difficult in, today's, media environment to have nuanced conversations about science. But what it has to do with is the fact that something Californians are very familiar with, this ridiculously resilient ridge. Many of you have heard this term, this tendency for high pressure over the West Coast, California, in the winter that's been forcing the storms northward, denying the rainfall and the snowfall that California relies upon for its water resources, giving us, a warm weather, which can seem nice, but it also means that California isn't getting the rainfall that it needs. And that particular pattern of the jet stream has become more prevalent in recent years. There's a colleague of ours, Noah Diffenbaugh at Stanford University, who's done some really good research looking at how climate change may be impacting that particular pattern of the jet stream, where the jet stream sort of veers north, denying the west coast of those storms, and then crashes down in the east, giving us that extreme cold weather that we've been seeing. And there's an emerging body of evidence that it sort of speaks to the issue of surprises, things that we didn't understand, that we didn't know were in store. We are learning that there are aspects of climate change that we didn't really understand that are leading to impacts that we would not have expected. And in this case, the dramatic decrease in sea ice in the Arctic Ocean may be impacting the behavior of the Northern Hemisphere jet stream. A good friend of mine, Susan Joy Hassel, likes to say that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And clearly we are seeing that. The decrease in Arctic sea ice that might seem distant, and we might think that it impacts nobody but polar bears, and we might think that it can be dismissed, may be impacting weather down here in California, along the east coast of the U.S. Once again, in a way that isn't subtle, in a way that's pretty profound, in a way that we're actually feeling and seeing.
John Foley, how's this going to affect food production and other things?
Oh, well, if you don't mind, can I go back to that point too? Because I mean, that's understanding the jet stream, and I was linked to the Arctic and everything. That's Michael Mann can talk about that. But I just want to just relate to the audience. Another simpler kind of way to remember this is the United States covers less than 2% of the Earth's surface. Okay, so if it's cold in the eastern half, that's like 1% of the planet. So it's kind of like saying it's cold outside Trump Tower today, so therefore the world is cold. And it's kind of like, saying that someone ate a Big Mac today and therefore there's no global hunger. In fact, I did tweet that and I got into a lot of crap for that. But
did Al Gore retweet it?
No, thank God. But I got plenty of other stuff. But in terms of food production, I mean, climate is intimately connected to everything we do, whether it's our food or our water or even our energy systems and our health. But approximately right to food. I mean, yeah, we're seeing increasing problems with food production as the world's population and diets become more and more demanding for food production. And a lot of that is being caused by climate instability or long-term climate change, just at a point when we can't afford that. So for the first time in a long time, the number of global hungry people has been going up again, which is kind of reversing a lot of progress we've been making. So it's not an immediate all-out emergency, but it's something that we need to really, really watch, especially among the most vulnerable people. There are about 800 million people in the world right now who are food insecure, which mainly means they don't have the economic ability to go out in the market and get the food they need. But those are the people who always suffer first. And that's the incredible irony of this, is it's the global rich, people like ourselves, who are emitting the gases that are causing most of this problem, but it's always the global poor, even in our own country, but of course across the world, that are always paying the price first. And that's really why this is ultimately really a moral dilemma, just as much as a scientific and engineering one.
We're going to go to our lightning round, where we ask quick questions or quick answers of our guests today. The first part is I will mention a name or a phrase and ask for the first thing that pops into your mind, unfiltered and with complete disregard for what anyone will think about it. Michael Mann, President Trump's White House science advisor.
Non-existent.
Yeah. John Foley, ExxonMobil.
Complicated. Yeah.
John Foley, offshore oil drilling.
Not a good idea.
Okay, this is true or false. Michael Mann, true or false, the biggest heroes in your personal story are Republican.
True.
John Foley, many foods you love will be more expensive because of climate disruption.
Absolutely true.
Michael Mann, sometimes you censor yourself when talking to friends about climate change impacts because you don't think they really want to know the dark truth.
No.
John Foley, your wealth and privilege will protect you from the worst impacts of climate disruption.
Mine or general? I don't think so. Probably.
Relative.
Yes.
John Foley, you sometimes feel guilty about that.
Absolutely.
Michael Mann, you are currently suing true or false, you are currently suing the National Review and Competitive Enterprise Institute for defamation related to blog posts about you.
That would be true.
John Foley, true or false, politicians should edit science about our personal health.
No.
True or false, Michael Mann, you can summon empathy for a person working in a coal mine or on an oil rig to support their family.
Absolutely.
Last one, John Foley. The climate would be healthier if more 50-year-old white guys talked about it on stage and on radio.
Well, I guess we'll see.
All right, that ends our lightning round. Let's give them a round for getting to that. John Foley, we've been talking a lot about the physical sciences. Climate is a conversation anchored in chemistry and physics and the models that people like Mike Mann study. I'm interested in the cognitive sciences and whether the California Academy gets into that area about the science inside our head. Why aren't we getting this, responding to these flashing red warning lights, and why we process information and threats in the way that we do?
Well, I'm convinced we've really kind of blown most of the climate change story as an environmental community, as a scientific community. There's a very common report, a lot of you should go look up if you haven't seen it, called the 6 Americas report. Some of you are nodding, and it's really kind of amazing. It talks about there are 6 different kind of zeitgeist in America, different groups of people essentially who react to climate change very differently. About 10% of Americans are vehemently, absolutely never going to believe this ever, ever, ever. That's only 10%. And there's maybe 15% who are like, oh my God, we're all gonna die on this side over here. That leaves about, we'll see, but that leaves about 75% of us in the middle who are just hiding under our desk right now, hoping it'll go away. Because both sides are using fear as the message, whether it's drowning polar bears in Al Gore's movies or Leonardo DiCaprio's movies. That isn't helping. It's just showing negative images of how bad everything is without offering solutions. So I think we have to move from messages of fear to messages of hope. Not blind optimism, but hope. Hope is where you roll up your sleeves and get to work. And stop talking about the problem. If you haven't heard about the greenhouse effect by now, you're never going to hear it anyway. So talk about solutions. We have all the solutions we need right now. People get very excited about that. And I think talk more about collaboration as opposed to competition. It's not about Republican versus Democrat or companies versus small town. It's about a better future. And I don't know about you, but I mean, the team that's working on this includes, Pope Francis and Michael Bloomberg and Elon Musk and Arnold Schwarzenegger and a lot of you. I want to be on that team. So I don't care what party you're in. So I think we have to reframe the narrative to grab the middle. But environmental groups tend to, and I know why they do it, hit the fear and panic button because it activates their donors and their base. Just like any political party, and that's like 5 or 10% of Americans that'll write a check and go out and protest for you. But you just pissed off another 5 or 10% of Americans who hate you now. And you left the rest of us feeling anxious, freaked out, and basically paralyzed. And what's really disturbing, more than anything else about this right now, is Americans feel more powerless and more anxious than we have in a century. We've been polling this forever. We're more freaked out than we were during World War II, during the Depression, during Vietnam and Watergate. And we're doing it to ourselves. So, this is really disturbing. I think we have to really recapture that narrative. Thanks.
If you ask a person, certainly a person, an American of a certain age, they will think of Bill Nye as a climate communicator. John Foley, how effective a climate communicator is Bill Nye?
Well, I think he's very well-intentioned. I loved him when he was on his children's show, but I'd rather see Michael Mann on TV, somebody who actually has studied climate science and has made a life's work of it. Mr. Nye has not, but also I find his demeanor kind of arrogant, personally. He kind of likes to put down people and make fun of them. I don't think that's how you win hearts and minds. So I actually don't find him that effective. Others will disagree, but I'm going to be a skeptic on that one. I'd really rather see scientists and people from faith groups, from businesses, and people who are really on the front lines of doing this, not wannabe celebrities, and people who have empathy, and people who are trying to really connect to hearts and minds and not just score a quick point. But that's me. I do value the work he's doing, but I think there ought to be other voices at the stage, and not just a bunch of 50-year-old white guys.
And
speaking as one.
Speaking of which, and you think Al Gore and Leonardo DiCaprio are predictable messengers who don't really bring new people in, that they're expected to say what they say, and
doesn't help. Hollywood liberal, Al Gore, I want Bruce Springsteen to talk about climate change or something that, like everybody can get behind. Like, who doesn't love Bruce Springsteen? Well, okay, maybe somebody to, who? Yeah, no, but I don't know. Somebody like that would be great.
Warm in the USA.
Yeah, that's great.
Climate needs an anthem. As a professor, you teach young students every day. What gives you hope about we're going to keep to this lower end of the spectrum of warming that you and John Foley talked about?
Yeah, well, in part, it is the students. It is the energy and the enthusiasm that I see come in to Penn State University every year when I teach my first-year seminar course. And it's a cultural transition that we're undergoing right now. Younger folks get it. They understand that the decisions we're making now about our energy infrastructure have long-term consequences for them and their children and their grandchildren. They're not yet in a position to really influence policy at the highest level, and so they need our help in the meantime. They need those of us who are in the mid-career stage to to do everything we can to make sure that we don't sacrifice those options in the meantime. They get it. And when they're in charge, we can be sure that the ship is going to be run properly. But we have to make sure that we don't steer it into the iceberg in the meantime. And I'm optimistic because we are seeing a lot of progress. California is sort of a shining beacon for the rest of the country, demonstrating that you can both increase energy efficiency, lower carbon emissions, incentivize renewables and electric vehicles, and grow the economy at the same time. It can be done. It's happening here in California. We are seeing that around the rest of the world. We're seeing a remarkable increase in the market share of renewable energy. So as John said very early on, really the only decision we have to make right now here in the U.S. is, are we going to get on board with the greatest revolution of this century, the clean energy revolution, or are we going to get left behind? That's the decision that we have to make, and I'm confident we'll make the right one.